Good day, colleagues. It is a huge pleasure to be with you this afternoon to discuss an incredibly important topic, one of urgency, but one also of hope and promise. As you know, this webinar is focused on graduate student mental health and well-being, the results of a collaborative project with the Jed Foundation, and supported generously by the Alfred P. Sloan and Mellon Project. Let me begin by explaining actually a few reminders before we get started. Please do note that this event is being recorded. The questions can be submitted at any time via the GoToWebinar Q&A panel, and that we will make access to the webinar recording and slides available in the coming days. Perhaps another word is in order, and that is to simply highlight the project goals, which is to create an evidence base to inform policies, programs, resources on graduate student mental health. And again, we're delighted to be doing this work in collaboration with the Jed Foundation and with the support of Alfred P. Sloan and Andrew Mellon. So I hope today you will have 5 takeaways from our project. Beginning in 2017, studies began appearing documenting a very high level of anxiety and stress among graduate students. According to some of those early studies, as much as twice as high among doctoral students as it was among the general population. Then again in 2018, the National Academy's report on graduate STEM education for the 21st century highlighted the importance and imperative that we begin finding mechanisms for supporting graduate student well-being. And we found in our own work in 2018 that nearly 2/3 of our graduate dean respondents not only reported that students were challenged by stress and anxiety, but that they were struggling even more than with mental health challenges than they had even 5 years earlier. I want you to take note of the time. This is 2018. And this is pre-pandemic. Well, we certainly know that a pandemic has exacerbated the problem. In fact, 1/3 of graduate students in a recent study conducted by Craig Ogilvie and his colleagues found that students reported symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder and clinically significant anxiety or depression. And while the study was fielded before the George Floyd killing, in the follow-up conversations and focus groups, the notion of anti-Blackness, of the health and financial disruptions, and the career uncertainty, all engendered by COVID or exacerbated by COVID, turned out to be major sources of stress. I do want you to think about this post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, because of course that means that the effects of COVID on graduate student mental health will have a long tail, and it will certainly require us to think differently about the kinds of student support services we provide, but also about the pedagogies we will use. I do want to make one other point, and that is that it's extremely important to note that the consequences of COVID and the stresses it has engendered are not evenly distributed. For example, we know from work we're doing that women bore and continue to bear a disproportionate share of the caregiving burden, both for dependent children and other family members. And this point was raised repeatedly in focus groups, in the Ogilvie study, but also in our own NSF-funded study. Also from that study, we found that women of color in particular, were much more likely to have reported losing an outside job or having hours of work reduced, thus contributing to the financial uncertainty that is another major driver of stress. It's really interesting that universities were actually quite good at protecting the financial aid packages that students received. In fact, I think somewhat less than 12% of students actually had any reduction in their funding package. But when there was a reduction, it was women and especially it was persons of color especially who experienced reduced funding. So it is clear that stressors are unevenly distributed across race and ethnicity, But it is also true that stressors are disproportionately distributed at different points of the graduate student life cycle. So for example, from our earlier DIMAC NSF funded study, we know that nearly 2/3 of PhD candidates, those who have passed qualifying exams who are moving into the dissertation phase, report worrying at least occasionally or more frequently about their physical and mental health. And that is in contrast to less than 60% for pre-candidates. Similarly, 45% of STEM students in the dissertation phases reported extreme feelings of isolation, and that's compared to 32% of pre-candidates. And again, this is prior to COVID. Well, attention then to the timing of stresses is important. I want to go on to note that while approximately 60% of our graduate deans report that their university has a framework for promoting mental health and well-being among graduate students, less than half of those having such a framework reported that there were elements of it or of the plan or of resources that were tailored specifically to the needs of students from marginalized racial, ethnic, or identity groups. And when you turn to look at the remaining universities that had no plan specifically addressing the needs of graduate students, less than 1 in 5 had a plan or targeted resources focused on the needs of students of color and from these various subgroups. Our review of the literature suggests overall that very little is known about these resources, the resources and needs, and the literature about those needs is underdeveloped. Particularly, I would say, in the area of students who occupy multiple marginalized identities, what we often call intersectionality. So clearly, more research is needed. There's still things we do not know, and our report actually neatly documents 3 broad domains where we think scholars and community members need to be doing more work. We need to know more about the unique needs of various graduate student groups, students of color, those from the LGBTQ community, students with dependents, those with disabilities, veteran students, and significantly and importantly, master students, about whom, despite the fact that they are about 80% of all graduate students, virtually nothing is known. The report also highlights the unique needs of international students. Second domain we argue we need more research is in understanding the cultural and organizational dynamics that influence different groups' pathways to care, and similarly, how effective the resources and services are that we provide to these different groups as they make their way into and through the support system. And the third area for research really focuses on the need to better integrate the now disparate bodies of research that come out of the traditional mental health paradigms, the student development, and the graduate student experience literature. So you can't have an academic product without saying more research is needed. But I really want to make the point, the advisory committee wants to make the point, the project makes the point that this challenge is simply too pressing, it's too urgent to wait until all the evidence is in. So our project is a call to action, first to graduate deans, then to graduate mentors, but also to the broader community of individuals who are uniquely situated in the graduate education ecosystem to support students, not only students who are experiencing challenges, but to support the creation of climates that are more supportive of mental health, not only for students, but for the faculty, advisors, and staff who nurture and support them. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of a statement of principles and commitments for graduate deans. I am thrilled to say that as of today, and this is our formal launch, 157 US and Canadian universities have already signed on to the document. And after I walk through at a high level, the framework will turn to the call to action to the broader community. So our framework begins with a vision statement, the position that our graduate education should be supportive of the academic success and well-being of all students. It includes values, principles, commitments, and statements of accountability, which I will go over very briefly, and I hope that you will read in more detail. You should know that this statement was developed by participants in an October convening, which brought together graduate deans, graduate students, disciplinary societies, researchers, and mental health professionals. So what are the anchoring values? That graduate education should be student-centered, that the learning environment should support the whole student, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is central to high-quality graduate education, and that the rules and processes and evaluative systems embedded in graduate education should be transparent. The principles, from these values, we derive a series of principles. Well-being is a foundation of student success, that thriving, not surviving, is the goal, that different students experience the challenges of graduate education differently, and they themselves differ in significant ways from the experiences of undergraduates. And also that faculty, staff, and administrators who along with graduate students may themselves experience significant stress. And what are the principles? And I think that's where I leave it. There are a set of commitments of things we promise to begin in advancing the agenda over the coming year. And again, I would refer you to the document. So what about the call to the broader community? First, I want to recognize that work-life balance is a major concern among current students and prospective graduate students. We know from a recent study conducted in conjunction with NAGAP and with the support of Liaison International that work-life balance is a major concern for all students, slightly more for women than men, but a broad-ranging concern for all students. And from that same study, we know that concern about campus culture and climate is somewhat more pronounced for students of color than majority students. And it's not just active discrimination, not just microaggressions that matter. As one interview said in a recent study, the program really doesn't acknowledge that minority students are minority. I wasn't discriminated against, but I wasn't acknowledged either. You aren't going to offend minority students because you acknowledge their background. Don't treat them differently, but acknowledge them. I feel like the program was trying to be colorblind, but a color acceptance model might have been better for minority students. So if we're going to create an experience where all students have an opportunity to thrive, individuals situated at each of the important nexus, intersections in the graduate education enterprise need to place a premium on creating, indeed expecting, a climate that places wellness and balance, inclusion and respect center front. They need to use the organizational levers available to them to affect change, and they need to model these values as they work and lead. And thus we begin our broader call to action with presidents and provosts. By virtue of their position at the top of the organizational chart, presidents and provosts really can set the tone for an entire university. They can and should ensure that campus mental health plans seriously consider the unique needs of graduate students. They need to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion as fundamental, essential characteristics of educational quality. And they need to begin exploring ways to alter or to mitigate the effects of the hyper-competitive research environments that are so stressful for students and for faculty members. They need to do this in conjunction with boards of governors and other governing bodies in a deep discussion of how do we value and understand and acknowledge what high impact scholarship is, and do it in a way that supports and nurtures continued scientific and scholarly progress, but not to the detriment of students and faculty mental health. Our next call to action is to graduate deans, who, in addition to the framework document that lays out a few to-dos in their domain, it's also important because they are at a point of leading policy discussions that impact university-wide programs. Graduate students, faculty, and programs, first, they can and should consider becoming a signatory to the framework. Review all long-standing policies that might adversely affect graduate student mental health and success, and serve as an advocate for the graduate student voice on campus-wide initiatives and task forces. Department chairs and directors of graduate studies also have a critical role to play in supporting graduate student mental health, in part because they are uniquely situated to understand the disciplinary cultures, the expectations of their colleagues, and the structure of key milestones and program requirements. It is for that reason that it is in this domain where they can and should begin developing mechanisms for recognizing and rewarding high quality mentoring, the kind that is supportive of well-being and academic progress and growth, to ensure that all program expectations, resources, and processes are transparent, and to also begin understanding how the particular combination of stress points in their discipline and their department, often associated with program milestones, impact students, and begin exploring mechanisms to support students through those points of transition. Well, graduate faculty, that is our graduate mentors, also play an extremely important role in a student's success and well-being. We know that conflict with mentors is often cited as a major stressor in students' lives. However, it is also the case that faculty can, in modeling work-life balance and being clear about expectations for students' academic performance and well-being, support both the productivity and accomplishments of their students and their overall well-being. Indeed, the two are interconnected. Because anxiety about career uncertainty is another one of the major stress points, candid conversations about, and opportunities to discuss diverse career goals and engage in the kinds of career development and professional development supportive of different pathways for conducting our working lives and our science and our scholarship are really important. And simply knowing that it is appropriate and okay, as we would with friends and loved ones, to express concern for those we worry may be struggling and simply help to get them to the resources they need to be successful. Well, students themselves also have a role to play. They have a role to play in helping faculty and administrators understand their particular concerns. They have a role to play in supporting their peers. They also have a really important role to play in helping the undergraduate students they teach. Graduate students have agency. We need to create organizational structures that support that agency, but they can and should connect with fellow graduate students and with their undergraduate students and mentees, and connect them to the professionals and resources that can support them in times and periods of distress. And they need to embody the principle of self-care, work-life balance, if you will, and compassionate mentoring. And last but not least, we call to the funding agencies. Well, funding agencies should not be held responsible for initiating the change that universities themselves can make and undertake and must make and undertake. They can provide additional incentives that accelerate university and system change. And for that reason, funding agencies can and should analyze how current grant review practices exacerbate hypercompetitiveness and faculty postdoc graduate student stress. They should support research to better understand graduate student health and well-being for those subgroups about whom little is known. There are probably a number of other things embedded in the call for recognition of the quality of mentoring, in the consideration and review of research proposals that need to be entertained. But there are many different mechanisms to ensure that thinking about students' long-term careers and their aspirations is embedded and a part of consideration of the quality of research. Well, there are many more things we could discuss. I hope we will discuss. I urge you to read the report. This has been a very high-level overview, but at this point, I would like to welcome our panelists and members of the Project Advisory Board. So I will begin by welcoming Michael Cunningham. Mike is the Associate Provost of Graduate Education and Research at Tulane University, and Tammy Bakahazi, who is Dean of the Graduate College at Boise State University. Next, I'd like to welcome Susanna Harris. She is CEO and founder of PhD Balance, and Barry Schreier, Director of the University Counseling Center at the University of Iowa. We're going to have a panel discussion facilitated by my colleague Nancy Roy, who's the Chief Clinical Officer at the JED Foundation. But before I can you hand the podium over in Zoom? Before I turn it over to you, Nancy, let me make just one more point, and that is regarding questions. Again, please submit your questions to the GoToWebinar Q&A panel. We're also happy to answer questions by email after the webinar. So please email nujo at cgs.nche.edu, and we will make sure to follow up and get back with you. And so, without further ado, I'm turning my camera off, and it's handing it off to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you so much for that overview. It was really comprehensive, and I think hit on the main points that we all settled upon throughout the project. So I appreciate that, and I hope it was informative to the audience. So I'd like to turn now to the panel and hear your thoughts on some of the major points that I think you have quite a bit to contribute on. So let's start with you, Susanna. I'm wondering, in your experience, what is this particular moment in time like for graduate students and recent alum? And what are you hearing are their greatest needs as you talk with students?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, so much for having me, not just on the panel, but in the discussion, because I know that there is a big focus on amplifying students' voices. And throughout a lot of, when we started this campaign, I was still finishing up my graduate work at UNC Chapel Hill. And so I was one of the first in my department to graduate into a pandemic. I was one of the first to do one of those virtual seminars back when we thought this would be a month-long thing. And I think what that brings up is just this feeling of uncertainty. And as I know that everybody who has done graduate school, that's sort of a core tenet of graduate school, is feeling uncertain. But I think for all of this year, it's really been amplified. And the two things that we're hearing a lot of is, to Suzanne's earlier point, students really want to have it acknowledged that they are having a difficult time. They want to hear from their advisors directly, and not even from their program directors, but from their advisors, that their advisors understand this is really, really difficult, that their advisors understand that the students are in a different situation than they are. And to that point of everyone's in a different boat in the same storm, that general acknowledgement of that we are in different positions. We don't know what people's home lives are. We don't know what other stressors people are going under. So there's just such a power, especially thinking about that extra level of uncertainty students are feeling all the time, of just saying, hey, I know it's really hard. The other big thing to think about right now, and we're hearing more and more often, is that we keep saying going back to the new, or going back to normal. A lot of people have started graduate school during a pandemic. A lot of people have left graduate school during a pandemic. I don't actually know what is normal. Everything that's about to happen is a new normal for me. And so to keep that in mind as well, of when we're bringing graduate students back, to be mindful of the fact that they don't know what they're getting into. They've been going through this situation, but for so many people, it will feel like the first year, even if they've been in it for an entire year.
That's a really good point, Susanna. Thank you for that. I'm curious, as we think about coming back and quote the new normal, I'm not sure normal is really going to be a word in our vocabulary after a while. But I'm hoping and I'm thinking that as faculty and staff themselves have had to deal with remote instruction and, working from home and the challenges that poses, that there'll be more sort of empathy for the student experience, which we're all in the same boat, and oftentimes when we're all facing a similar challenge, it can go a long way toward advancing that empathetic response. So thank you for that. So Michael and Tammy, let me turn to you and ask, if you can say a little bit about the urgency of these issues at your particular institutions, and how are the challenges today different perhaps than they were not just before the pandemic, but maybe even 5 years ago?
Thank you. I'll start if that's okay. I think like many presidents of universities across the nation, this is really a top priority for our president at Boise State, and she has started a working group on having a thriving community. And so the graduate education is really having or I should say this is focusing on the whole community, but we've ensured that the graduate education part is a piece of that. And what we're seeing in our graduate students is really a request and a usage of services. For example, our individual counseling sessions are being used much more frequently. We have more people who are wanting to get into our groups, and we're also seeing increased attendance at our workshops. So we're pleased that our graduate students are reaching out for help. And they're letting us know that they want this support. Within that, what we are seeing is that it's a lot what Susanna talked about is what they're experiencing themselves. But I think we also are hearing that sometimes they're not receiving, and this is understandable, they're maybe not receiving as much support as they once did from their faculty or their advisor, because I think faculty have just been working so hard and asked to do so much over this last year that they're feeling, the faculty are feeling just exhausted and their own challenges. And so our students are being affected by that. On the other hand, and I'll just finish with this and then send it over to Michael, is we're also at the graduate college hearing more from our own faculty and their concern and urgency about the students' well-being. For example, I've gotten more phone calls and emails where our faculty are worried about our students being able to find housing, or worried about food insecurities for our students, or either other needs. I was talking to one professor who saw that his student had a bag around his foot, and it was because the shoes were being so worn out that this faculty member actually bought shoes for the student. So we're also seeing a lot of faculty focus or request to help students, and probably like many graduate deans, I'm used to getting requests for more GA support or increasing the salary or stipend, but I've also seen a lot more of those requests coming through my office.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, thank you. To add to what Tammy has already mentioned and some of the stuff that Susanna has mentioned as well, the pandemic has just sort of highlighted a long overdue issue for graduate students. And so understanding mental health and the challenges and wellness for graduate students is not new, but the pandemic has sort of brought it to surface a lot more. And it's been especially a challenge at Tulane because Tulane does not have a graduate school. So graduate education is very decentralized. And students are in the academic schools, and in my role, I deal with sort of university policies associated with graduate education. And so our typical communication to students was very undergraduate centric. And graduate students represent between, at a low, 35% to a high, about 45% of our student population. And so graduate students were not even paying attention to some of these centralized messages coming out to students about how we're dealing with the pandemic, how we're dealing with surveillance testing and COVID-19 testing on campus. They say, oh, that's for undergraduate students. So making sure that they understood some of those issues were of utmost importance was important as well. But then when we started talking to our graduate populations, we realized, as Suzanne introduced, our students are quite diverse. Our master's students are quite different than our PhD students. And these students are quite different than students in the professional programs, in the JD programs, MD, MSW, architecture programs, and so forth. And that one step can sort of deal with all of our students. And then when we talk with the PhD students in particular, they tend to have dual roles. They have this dual role of being a student, but then they're also serving as a teaching assistant or an instructor of record. And so they're dealing with not only their own sort of mental health issues and challenges and well-being, but then they start hearing the mental health challenges and well-being of their students, and trying to sort of play the go-between between those two people as well. And when we talk about doctoral students, in particular PhD students, when they get to the advanced level, many of them want to go part-time because they can save money on fees. And when you save money on fees, that also many times means that you don't have access to university health services. And this is also the time when you need those services the most, when you're at the dissertation stage. And so the pandemic has sort of resurfaced or surfaced a need that's been there all the time. It's allowed us to have more candid conversations about what needs to be centralized and how we can support students more fully.
I'm sighing because, and when I think about all of what you just said, I myself feel exhausted. So I can only imagine how, graduate students are trying to navigate through this. And I must say, even thinking back about my own graduate experience, somehow it doesn't feel like it was as trying or laborious as what I think we're hearing today. And, I will just follow up on something you said, Tammy, about your college president, which is great. And we know that the American Council of Education reports on their recent surveys, I think of the past 3 years in a row, mental health is top of mind for college presidents. I'm not sure that they always have graduate student mental health top of mind within that sort of broad view. So hopefully, this work will help bring that more to the foreground, to have graduate student mental health specifically identified as part of the larger strategic plan. And so, Tammy, you also set Barry up quite nicely as the director of counseling, since you mentioned that in your experience, students are accessing services more, wanting more services. And so, Barry, I'm curious, in your experience, what you've observed about the graduate students that you all see, and how they might vary, how the needs might vary by different populations that you serve.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And first off, I just want to say thank you for producing this publication, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the advisory group that helped with this. And the other thing I'll say is it's sometimes difficult to be on a panel with really smart people and be the one that goes last, because you can sort of find yourself saying like, yeah, I just mostly agree with what they said. I'm not sure there's anything else to say, but a lot of good stuff got said. And so I want to just highlight all of these things are sort of very salient. A couple of things that I will talk maybe about to sort of highlight is kind of maybe some larger heuristics that we see that are impacting our graduate students. One is, we talk a lot about mental health. What we're finding really is that a lot of our students are simply struggling with well-being. I think a really critical thing that we have to be thoughtful about is how we message our students about their struggle. As soon as we start saying depression's up, anxiety is up, we communicate in sort of a larger heuristic way that the problem is the student. You're struggling with depression, you're struggling with anxiety, and what we may be finding out is that while there is pathology, it's not necessarily within the student, it's outside of the student. They're simply responding to the mess that is around them. And how could one not be stressed and anxious and feeling sad in this current time? And so just being really thoughtful about how we message our students about where the struggle is and how they're responding to it, because they may simply be having challenges to their well-being. And it's hard to feel well right now. And when we're not feeling well, our mood simply just goes along with it. But it may be a reasonable response to what's in front of us and not a pathological or a disordered response to what's in front of us, because the disorder and the pathology may actually be outside of me. I'm simply responding to it. So if we hold on to things like a concept of well-being, we message our students better to sort of talk to them also about they have persevered this year. They have persisted this year. They have worked as a community to make their campus work. And we cannot lose sight of the resilience our students have shown, because they have so much strength. And when we only lead into sort of how they're not doing well, they begin to believe us. They listen to us and they believe that they're not doing well, and they have done really well, and they are in a lot of distress. And so I think that's a really critical thing for us to hold on to. And we see students sort of saying like, well, I read all this stuff about depression and anxiety, and my faculty are worried about me, and the dean's putting out all this information, but like I'm still working. And so it is sort of holding a both and with our students to say, you may be holding a lot of stress and you're persevering, and you can do both of those things at the same time. The other thing that I'll share that I think is a really critical thing is the fall is going to be an interesting time. And one of the things we're talking about here at the University of Iowa is we're almost moving into a post-vention time. We've been so busy intervening and doing intervention that we're really moving into a post-vention time. And we have a critical opportunity around our graduate students and our professional students to assist them with coming out of crisis. And we all know the research that when crisis eventually settles, and this has been a weird crisis because there's not an end date to it, and it's been very ambiguous, right? Sometimes, usually when there's a crisis, it ends, and we're sort of aware that it's over. And this one has sort of continued on, and when it's going to actually end is not clear. So it's a unique crisis to us in that way. But what we know is in the aftermath of crisis, if we don't respond, what happens is the trauma of it, the distress of it, the grief and loss of it starts to create its own problems, because those things go unresponded to or unmitigated, and we don't sort of talk about recovery. And so I think it's a really critical thing for us as we move into the fall to be thinking about not just kind of like how do we handle our students and their sense of well-being and their mental health, but how do we sort of like think about it in a post-vention kind of model, so that we're doing particular things and being out in front of this conversation. So specifically around our graduate and professional students, so that we're helping them in recovery, helping to mitigate the escalation of these symptoms, and helping reduce kind of the negative impacts that we know are going to come as a result of when things begin to settle down again.
Thank you. Really good points. I think it's important to emphasize, and I think Suzanne brought this up in her opening comments, that just because we may be going back to campus or having a hybrid, and the pandemic as we know it is on the decline, or we're all vaccinated, the aftermath, as you talk about postvention, the aftermath is not going to be gone in 6 months. When you think about historically other significant, environmental and other experiences that our country has had, the effects are long lasting. And so we really need to be thinking, not just about welcoming everyone back and for the first couple of months paying attention to how they're doing, but really long term. And I guess the other point that you raised that struck a chord with me was let's not forget some of the good things we've learned as a result of the pandemic. And I think looking at people as whole human beings has really risen to the top, as faculty have been talking with students in their homes, and they see their home lives and begin to really viscerally see the whole life of the graduate student. And hopefully at least that won't go away, because that's one of the big sort of findings of our report, is looking at the whole student. So I'm going to turn now to some questions about the report and the findings and recommendations, and ask you, Michael and Tammy, as deans, how do you plan to use the recommendations on your campus? And as professionals who have expertise in mental health, what advice would you give other deans on their campuses as they try to begin this outreach process?
And Tammy, would you like me to go first?
Go ahead, be my guest.
Okay. I've said to people at other places the other places outside of New Orleans, that the world is experiencing what Tulane and New Orleans experienced 15 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things that came out from that experience is that we all have to have an emergency plan in terms of alternate email addresses, information about alternative contacts, and all those kind of things. And so that's helped us in one way sort of prepare for this current pandemic. But the second thing that we have to do now too, and what I've started to do, is partnering with that counseling center. And so I had brunch, as a matter of fact, this past Sunday with Barry's equivalent at Tulane to talk about how we can use this report to make sure we have some programming that's specific to graduate students. The second thing is that to include students as a part of the conversation, because they tend to know a lot of the intricacies of what's going on in life in terms of some of those issues too. I'm also, in terms of my academic background, I'm a developmental psychologist. And so I've been pushing the understanding of just developmental needs of students. And if we think about students who go right from undergrad to graduate school, they're pretty young. And if there's a biological basis of any psychopathology, it may start to show up during the graduate school years. And so just knowing about that, we also know the changes in what we know about brain development for students too. For example, many of my XY chromosome colleagues, our brain is not fully developed until we're about 23 to 25 years old. And so there's unevenness in brain growth and development needs to be considered, because the amygdala, which controls the emotion, develops before the frontal lobe, which controls reasoning. So having that kind of understanding about that, but then also making sure we put in programs that are developmentally specific and sort of think about the life cycle of graduate students. One of the things that we did pre-pandemic was putting together a policy for childbirth leave for graduate students who are on stipends. During the pandemic, this is expanded to all students. And so in Tulane, has developed a website called pregnancy.tulane.edu for students to go get information about if I'm going to adopt, foster, or become a parent, what do I do? And it connects students with a case manager to help deal with that specific situation. So think about the life cycle of a graduate student. And what are the typical things that students need during that particular time in their lives, and how can we support the well-being and not just focus on some of the crises?
Thank you. Tammy?
Yeah, I think how we can best use the recommendations and findings is that we bring attention to it and we get it into the people's hands across our university. So at Boise State, we have a fairly centralized graduate approach, and so it really will fall on the graduate college to do that, and we're up for that. We've got plans to include it on our webpage at the graduate college. We'll use all of our social media to alert people. We'll send it out in our newsletters, and then even send a specific email to department chairs and program coordinators bringing their attention to this. I also plan to send this to all of my dean colleagues, and already are planning to have a time during a dean's council where all of the deans can not only just talk about what's in there and what they could do in their college, but what do we want to do as a university for kind of larger next steps. At Boise State, we also have a program of Grad Well, Be Well to Do Well, and it's been a university-wide comprehensive approach to graduate student mental health and well-being. And through this, we have a faculty director. And what that faculty director has identified is she wants to use this to develop a call to action for faculty. And I'm really excited. She's got a lot of ideas. She wants to have focus groups with faculty. And from that, either how can faculty utilize what's in the recommendations and the findings, or do the faculty then come up with a companion document, if you will, to this current document on what the expectations or suggestions are for faculty. And I think that would be very powerful on our university and hopefully get more traction with faculty, especially because it's coming up through the faculty. And then a final idea that we are just starting to look at this week, and it came because we had such a good experience at a recent regional conference, and in that what we did is we brought together a panel of 5 to 7 students, each from a different university, and we had a very skilled facilitator, a psychologist, and he asked pre-arranged questions about mental health and well-being and what students were most worried about and what needs they had from their faculty, their advisors. And I tell you, that was one of the most impactful hours that one could have. And so we've started to look at, could we do something like that on our campus? For example, would there be 5 to 7 graduate students from across the university who would be willing to be on that panel, and our faculty can hear from them directly what it really is. Kind of like Michael said, we have to hear from the students, and we thought this might be a very organized, helpful way for our students to hear, or for our faculty to hear students' voices.
Yeah, I would say that was one of the most powerful pieces of this project for me, was listening to the student voice, hearing not only in the focus groups, but in the convening, what they had to say, because certainly we can come up with great ideas that we think are going to support our graduate students, but if we're not listening to what they say they need, how do we know if what we're putting in place is actually consistent with what they really require? So excellent points, both of you. And certainly, a faculty equivalent, back to something else you said, Tammy, around, what can faculty having a little bit more sort of grounding, and what can they be doing? And also, what do they need to do it well? This isn't just something that comes naturally to a lot of folks. And so what kind of education and support do faculty and staff need in order to be better at reaching out and contributing to that culture of caring and compassion that we're striving for? And so, Barry, I'm curious, if you were with Michael at that brunch that he had with the counseling center director, what might you say to deans and faculty about, outreach to student affairs and counseling centers in particular?
Well, first I would say it's lovely to be in New Orleans, and thanks for buying me brunch. I would say that first, because I'm sure that's how it was. So thank you. Yeah, a few things. Again, really great points made by my colleagues, and just want to highlight those. One of the most growing models in counseling centers that we are seeing, and it's across all sizes and types of campuses, is embedding staff. And we're seeing the growth of the embedded model, where counseling centers are hiring staff who are then embedded into sort of cohort populations there to serve those populations in particular. And the really sort of key thing that can come out of that is, because culture is such a critical piece, and understanding what the graduate and professional student experience is like, and what the life and culture is like for the staff and faculty that work in those spheres as well, is embedding staff into graduate colleges. And whether you have the finances to embed into every one of your professional schools, or whether it's sort of centrally into like a graduate college to serve all the colleges and professional schools, depending on your size and structure, allow someone to sort of then understand what the nature and the culture of graduate and professional life is, and then is there to then serve particularly those communities. And that can be kind of at that individualized level, right? That thing that we think about, which is that individual counseling. If we think in terms of a level of care model, individual counseling is the highest level of care. It is 1 hour of time of a professional's time to serve one student for 1 hour. It's a very high level of care. It's a huge resource use. And for some students, that's perfectly the right thing. But a lot of what we think about, especially when well-being is the thing we're thinking about, or sort of community postvention, is kind of a public health approach. Is we need folks embedded into communities providing kind of public health level intervention, programming, training, skill building, competence building for staff and faculty in particular. And so embedding someone into culture to sort of then work within that culture through an understanding that culture because they're there, and working at that public health level, gives a huge bang for buck, especially again if we're dealing with well-being kinds concerns. So that embedding model is a really good thing. Otherwise, what happens for counseling centers is the graduate school just becomes one more constituency on campus, and we don't know any more about you than we know about any other constituency on campus. And our report indicates to us that there are very highly specific needs of professional and graduate students, staff, and faculty. And so embedding someone allows them then to build that capacity of knowledge of what that culture is to be most effective within that culture. So that's the first thing I would say, Michael. After orange juice, and then once the meal came, we would then talk a little bit about, we talk a lot about intervention with our students. And the students are only but one focus. Staff and faculty become a really critical focus as well, because we sort of know that impact goes all and up and down the line. What stresses the dean gets passed to the department chair, which gets passed to the program coordinator, which gets passed to the advisors, which gets passed to the students, and all up and down that line. And so we often get focused only on our students, and it's really critical to help our staff and faculty. I'll give you an example. I had a faculty member call me the other day, graduate college, and say, oh my gosh, we're really worried about our student's really struggling, they're in my office, they're crying, we really think they need to come over to the counseling center and talk to someone, something's not. So I was like, well, what's going on? Well, their mom had just passed away. I'm like, do not send them to the counseling center, nothing's wrong with them, they're just sad. They may just need to talk to someone they know, which could be you. Don't send them here. As soon as you send them here, you tell them something's wrong and they need help. And they may just need to talk to you, someone they know. And so that training focused in kind of all up and down that line, so that there's shared assumptions about our language and how we communicate around mental health and well-being to our students, that there's sort of shared assumptions about how we respond. Sort of our first layer of response is not just sort of farm them out to another agency, but like hold them, right? Use that collaborative relationship, that familiarity with each other. And again, having embedded staff then can kind of help with all that training and support, because these aren't one and dones either. It's often a training and then a follow-up and then a post-mort after the semester to see how it all went. And so those are the two big broad brushstrokes that I think I would offer when we think about how to then help the graduate colleges and graduate schools in terms of implementing this plan.
Thank you, Barry. And you bring up something that's near and dear to my heart. And if we had another hour, I could talk on and on and on about it. And that is the role that faculty and staff have to play in supporting our students.
You bet.
No longer should we be, oh, Nancy looks tearful, or she looks like she's distressed, I better call the counseling center. That's, you put it so well. We face just normal life challenges, the death of a parent, trying to find childcare, a conflict, whatever it might be. And so often not all, but sometimes all a student needs is that warm hand and that warm outreach from someone who they know and respect in their world. And oftentimes it is faculty, especially for graduate students. They're not so much embedded in campus life, if you will, in most cases. And so their faculty or their mentor or advisor plays such a significant role in being that compassionate, warm hand. And it can go such a long way. And we know that not every student needs direct clinical service, but we all could use that warm hand and that level of human support. So thank you for bringing that up. Right. And so Susanna, let's turn to you as a student. Here we all are saying, oh, we think this, and this would be great for students. Let's hear from the student voice. What are your thoughts about how to do this work well and how to be sure to ensure the graduate student voice in any of what we do?
Yeah, and I think some of this experience comes from the group that I run called PhD Balance, which is focused on allowing graduate students to share their own personal stories. And so a lot of this is based off of what we have found. One of our current president is actually doing her PhD in the graduate student experience up at Purdue. And so she is going to be analyzing these stories, which I'm very excited about. But to that point, the thing about hearing graduate student experiences, and I think that we often want to keep in mind, is that these are individual students, right? We want to hear the individual stories and respect the fact that they don't represent everybody, and that one person who has my same background, looks like me, is not going to know my exact feelings. So keeping in mind that if we have 4 grad students at the table, that's better than 0, but just to remember they don't represent everybody. And to the point about representation, my 2 biggest pieces, the things to think about are to be selective and then to empower who you select. So if you put out a broad call on an emailing list, I will bet you quite a bit of money that most of the people who show up to that meeting are going to look like me. They are going to be white, cisgendered women. And that's because we have the bandwidth to deal with these things more. We are not dealing with racial structural issues. We're going to be younger. We're not dealing with socioeconomic issues necessarily. We're not dealing with a home family. We're not dealing with all of these different systems. And oftentimes we don't get men, I'm looking at our team, because there's that additional level of stigma against talking about mental health, mental illness. And so the solution to this is not just to say, well, we get what we get, who wants to show up is who wants to show up, but rather leverage these other communities that exist. Go to your diversity and inclusion office and have them put out the post. Go to your LGBTQ office and have them put out the post, have them nominate students, things like that. And then to the point of empowering students, let them know what they can do. Bring them to the table, but as we all know, graduate students and academics of all levels like to be active, so give them something tangible that they can work on. Don't just have them come to a meeting and chat, but you can say, we want you to design a survey. We want you to run this mental health day. Give them the power and give them the support that they need to actually make a difference. And they can, one thing that was brought up in this meeting back in October was that a lot of students really just wanted the opportunity to help each other. So to that point of empowering students to start acting as sentries for each other, because they're going to be hearing the stories first anyway. So just be selective, try to get people to show up that you need to hear the voices of. There are going to be people on your committee who really, really, really push back on this idea of, well, we can't select who comes here. We need to just put it out there. But it is important to have voices from different communities and to just respect the fact that you have to make an additional effort sometimes to bring these different voices to the table.
That's so important, Susanna. Jed works with schools across the country, and one of the things we say at every turn is, don't rely on all the usual suspects all the time when you're looking for the student voice. People turn to student government or the grad council or and those people are great, don't get me wrong, but what about the person who quietly sits in the back of the room, or other populations that you mentioned, but the voices we don't often hear. And so such a good point to be certain, to be broad-based in our thinking and trying to recruit students to let us know what they need and how they can help us in terms of teaching us, and certainly not to burden them with all the work, but if they have the capacity to offer the support to get them engaged with us in this mission. So thank you all so much. We'd like to turn now for the remaining time to the question and answer, open it up to the chat that Matt has been monitoring with the Q&A. And so I'll turn it over to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Nancy. If you're an audience member, please submit your question to GoToWebinar control panel now. The first question, I'll actually turn it right back around on Nancy. How will faculty model good work-life balance behavior for their students when they are under so much stress themselves?
Excellent question. And I think when you read the full report, the response to some of that is in the report. And I will say that, and I guess I should preface it by saying I sometimes am accused of always being the glass half full kind of approach to life, which is good and bad. Sometimes Pollyanna-ish I've been called, but I think if we're really going to be able to help faculty model work-life balance, Suzanne in the opening comments talked about the hyper-competitive nature of academia. I mean, that's not just for the graduate students who are vying for, scholarships, research grants, teaching fellowships, etc., but for our faculty and staff. I mean, look at our system, publish or perish, get tenure, teaching is sometimes low on the list in terms of how you're evaluated, let alone have time set aside for reaching out to students who may be struggling, or sitting down and having a half-hour conversation with someone, not about academics, taking away from your time to do your own research to get the tenure that you need to secure your employment. So honestly, and this is a tall order, I think we need to look at the entire system, because if we want faculty to be able to do this well, then we have to do the same thing for faculty. If we want faculty to acknowledge that students have whole lives, then we need to acknowledge that so do faculty and staff. And our systems need to change toward that end. So that's pie in the sky, perhaps, but I think it's also true.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that one? Yeah, go ahead, Tammy.
I would love to, Nancy. I think that's such a critical piece, is that we need to really focus also on our faculty and staff, and that has to happen at a central administration or executive level. And while they're talking about student success, I think it's difficult to have student success if you don't have faculty and staff success, right? Unhappy faculty really bring unhappy students. And so I just really wanted to reiterate that critical point. This is a systems issue, and we need to make sure that our leaders are recognizing how important the well-being of faculty and staff are to that of the student success.
I'd like to jump in too real quick if I could. Yeah, so a couple of other things, systems will change slowly, and so it kind of does also raise questions of like anything sooner. And a couple of things that we think about is faculty often find themselves communicating to students to say like work-life integration and harmony and all that kind of stuff, but like then don't do it, right? Like when you go home, but then I'm going to send you emails at 3 in the morning and those kinds of things. And what we find out is that sort of like encourages imposturing on our graduate students' behalf, because they understand like, oh, I got told this one thing, but clearly there's another thing that I have to keep myself up to, but you can't talk about it. And so this imposturing kind of sets up. And so one of the things we hear from our graduate students is, I just like to know the truth. Like if there's demands, just tell me there's demands. And if it's going to be super busy, then just tell me it's super busy. Don't make me kind of crazy by telling me one thing, but do another. So that's one thing and kind of a shorter thing. The other thing is we also say balance is work-life balance. Balance is hard, right? Because it's always got to be in balance. And then when it's not in balance, I'm like, you can't even do that right. And so we talk about things like work-life harmony or work-life integration, because the fact of the matter is during the bulk of the semester, you're going to be busy. You're probably going to be working more than you're playing. But maybe in December or in the summer, you should actually go play more than you work. And so that harmony or that integration kind of helps move that a little more, make that actually more obtainable, because we don't want people to feel like I can't even do the work-life balance thing right, because it's hard just to keep balance all the time. So those are a couple maybe shorter term things that folks can do, is harmony or honesty and transparency, and then just being forthright about like, yeah, during the 14, 15 weeks of the semester, you're going to work really hard. That's what we do. But you're only really busy 32 weeks a year, and the other weeks, you can go play a little bit more. So.
Go ahead,
You raised
Nancy.
an interesting point, Barry. I was just doing another talk a couple weeks ago, and what kept emerging is we often don't focus on staff. We focus on students and faculty, and sometimes staff are sort of in the back seat, sort of like graduate students are sometimes in the back seat relative to undergrads. And so we know, in most cases, faculty have more flexibility with their schedules. They may be able to take the summer or the month of December, but student affairs staff and others, administrative staff, facilities and operations, you name it. There's probably more staff on campus than faculty. They don't always have the same kind of flexibility. And I think we also and they have tremendous interaction with students. And so I think we also need to think long and hard about how we can, again, back to keeping some of the things we learned from the pandemic, what kind of flexibility can we offer, all employees of the university as well as students. It will differ depending on your job, obviously, and the requirements, but it's just one other constituent group that I think doesn't always get a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's great. As a staff person, I appreciate that.
I wanted to give a real personal an example that I heard from one of my colleagues, a female dean, who sent out a message to the listserv to the faculty who said, I'm available to have conversations with you, every day except for Tuesday evenings. That's the day that I go to my son's baseball game. And just sending that message out, let one faculty know that it's okay to acknowledge that you have kids and that your kids also need time for you to be a parent. And it also let the graduate students know, wow, these people have lives outside of our respective lives too. And that one simple message changed the zeitgeist of how people felt welcomed and felt comfortable bringing their entire authentic self to their jobs.
Well, thank you. We've got a question. One group or series of groups that hasn't come up much are outside resources. And so I was wondering, Tammy, a question for you. How are you engaging with community outside of campus to assist your graduate students and aid with cultivating a sense of belonging?
Yeah, thank you. We have really worked on this, and most recently, what we've done is we've brought together a group of faith leaders from within the university and also with our outside community. And we've engaged in a discussion with them on what they're seeing the needs are and how might we have a closer interaction with them to help our students, faculty, and staff. So that's just one example. Also, working with the legislature, I know that's not always easy, and certainly in this environment, but helping them to understand the importance of the university and the students and the well-being and the funding that is needed to ensure that we are moving in the right direction and that academic success and well-being for all students is met, and that it's an important aspect of the university's mission or agenda, if you will.
Suzanne, I've got a question for you. In your experience as a graduate student, what extent do you think faculty members really need training and development in order to respond compassionately to graduate students? And have you found that those types of trainings have been helpful?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of studies that show there's a really low level of empathy in graduate school. And I think a lot of times scientists need to be very logic-based and need to be able to look at things and be critical. But generally across the board, it's lower in academia, individual people's empathy, than in other fields. And I think we need to look at this as a skill. I myself am not naturally a very empathetic person, and it's actually allowed me to do some of the work that I'm doing because when someone tells me something that's very difficult, I don't take it on to myself. But it's also something that I have had to work on, and realizing I need to learn how to start a meeting by really asking someone how they're doing. It's not something that I need, it's not something that I think about, but realizing that's something that other people need to make them feel comfortable. And so unfortunately, as I'm sure a lot of people in the room know, the people who need the training are not usually the ones who show up to the trainings. And so I think making those things accessible and also encouraging them in some way, in some sort of, if there's a way to do a public acknowledgement of putting out an email and or a newsletter saying thank you so much to our faculty who attended this. Here is the list of people who attended. Making that stuff available. Even I did the Safe Zone training while I was in graduate school, and they gave us a little sticker to put next to our desk, and things like that that allow people to signal to others that they have done these trainings, and also allow graduate students to keep an eye out, because we have all had situations where while students are rotating, you're not told everything. But once you get into a lab, you start to hear, oh, it's a really good thing you didn't join that lab because he treats his third and fourth year students terribly. Or, you notice that there's all international students in there. That's because this person can exploit them to no extent. And so putting out things, allowing people, allowing faculty to get some credit for this work, I think is necessary. But I think it's useful across the board, actually. And one group we haven't mentioned at all is postdocs. And Postdocs, I mean, that's just another level of graduate school, but in even more isolation, right? They're just as unsupported in so many ways, but they also don't have as many colleagues. And so I think actually enabling postdocs to get some of this training can benefit them professionally in their future, but also could really benefit the community around them, and they can again act in those spaces. So I think it's a point of making these things available and incentivizing them, and even the smallest ways possible, I think is really, really helpful.
You know, I'd like to just add to what you said, Susanna, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of the quote trainings or educational programs that are out there are very long and they're very crisis focused. And I think that this work in terms of offering a warm hand and outreach is not rocket science. It's something, as you know, I forget who it was that mentioned, you know, just like you would, I think it was Suzanne in the beginning, just like you would to a family or a friend or whatever, you know, is everything okay? You look, you know, a little bit off today. I mean, if we, I think some of the resistance and some of the reason why not the majority of faculty or staff attend these trainings is, you know, some of them are 8 hours long. Some of them are asking you to know if someone's suicidal and what would you do? I mean, if I wasn't a mental health professional, I wouldn't want to go to those either. So let's think about making these trainings very tailored to the group that we're talking to, and brief. You know, what are the salient points? This information can get conveyed in 15, 20 minutes, I think, honestly, if you target it to the group that you're working with. So I think we need to think a little more creatively about how we're educating faculty and staff on these issues. I think we'd have more success.
I was just going to add too, we do a 1 hour working with students in distress workshop, and I am clearly of the opinion that the thing we sell during that workshop is confidence. We find all the time, staff and faculty, they know when something's not right. They know broadly what to say. They're human beings who navigate the world, and they just get hesitant, or they're not sure, or maybe this isn't my role, or I don't want to make it worse, or I don't want to say the wrong thing. And often I think we are just sort of helping staff and faculty lean into their sort of natural suchness, and we kind of just encourage them to just act in confidence rather than in doubt or hesitancy.
Yep.
I agree, and I think it's really important that we send the message that you don't have to have a background in this to make a difference. It's about, do you care about well-being and mental health? And I think hopefully everybody can say yes to that for their own and others. That's the quality we need them to have. And I would also just add, I think sometimes people think they have to do something really big. And what we're trying to share is, what do they say? Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And anything you do is helpful. So even if a faculty member will just put one little line on the syllabus about mental health or taking care of yourself, or anything you talked about, Nancy, on the work-life balance, or what do we all, that one line on a syllabus, most people could do. So really, like, you don't have to do big. You can do everything matters, and it can be one small thing that really is altogether much larger.
Okay, so that's all the time we have for the audience Q&A. I'll turn it back over to Nancy to start getting us closed out.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to actually invite Suzanne to join me so that we can wrap up and synthesize a little bit about what we heard. So I'll hand it over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Nancy. First, thank you to all of our panelists, our advisory group participants, for a really important and timely conversation. I simply have to say many, many thank yous to my CGS colleagues on the stage and behind the stage, and yours too as well at Jed, who have been keeping us on track and on target, to all the convening participants, and to all of you who are with us for this important conversation. We really hope that today starts a process of conversation, to be sure, but next steps as well. Again, I'd encourage you to look at the framework document for a set of reasonable commitments we can make, that we'll be at a better place next year than we are this year. So many thanks to all of you. Just as a point, couple of things to think about. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our campaign to support graduate student mental health and well-being. You can look in the chat for a link to materials that you can adapt and share. We've tried to create a communications toolkit that you'll be able to use, both to talk about the project, but to share results locally or with your colleagues, a press release for those universities who are already signatories, and infographics as well that try to explain the many parameters and dynamics of the project. How about you, Nancy? Want to make some more, extend your thank yous as well?
I do want to thank everyone who's been involved in the project. There's been a lot of people behind the scenes that have done a tremendous amount of work, in addition to our esteemed panelists and advisory group. Certainly Suzanne and Julia and Hero and just everyone at CGS has been great. It has been a privilege for me to represent JED on this project. You know, this is our mission at JED, is to promote emotional well-being among teens and young adults. And so it has really been an honor and a privilege for me to be able to work on the project and think about, you know, inclusivity of all populations in this supporting mental health, since so much focus is on undergrads. So it's really been great to shift the focus and think about the unique challenges of graduate students. So it's been very informative for me. I hope I was able to contribute some, but you know, the best part about a project is what you learn and take away. So I appreciate what I've learned from my colleagues, and thank you all for attending today. And as Suzanne urged you, please let's all carry the torch and bring this to our campuses and our coworkers and our colleagues, and move this work forward. This is the beginning, I would say. So let's keep one foot in front of the other. And thank you.
And one more thing is, do remember we will be sharing the webinar slides and recordings for you to review or share with other colleagues on your campus that weren't able to be with us this afternoon. And so with that, I think I will bid you all a good day. As a good friend of mine says, you end every meeting waving, because that way we're hardwired to smile when we wave. So what better way to end and begin a meeting? Take care all.